Hello, corporate finance students. This is Dr. Robinson. So we have an agenda for this series of lectures. So we're going to depart a little bit from talking about this quantitative time value of money stuff and do a little bit of big picture discussion about really what's the purpose of the firm, what do companies do, and then think a little bit about the decisions they make and how they're affected by different outcomes that can happen. So we're really going to kind of do this in two phases. In the first part, we'll talk about the purpose of the firm, and in the second part, we'll talk about introducing some uncertainty into our decision making. So to motivate the first thing, I just want to do a little thought experiment. If we were sitting together in class, we could do a little poll and get a feeling for it. But this is kind of just the general setup, because we have a company that is considering a project, and the project is an expansion that is a really good, profitable idea. So we know that the idea is good, it's going to benefit the firm, it's going to increase firm value. But there's two different ways we can do it. We can do a green version that we're just, for simplicity, we'll assume that these two ideas are exactly the same, except for one of them uses wind generation for the power necessary to do the project, and the other uses a coal-fired plant to generate the energy needed to do it. And obviously there's some concerns we have to abstract away from. But I think that the general idea that I'm trying to get at with this question is, given the choice between these two things, where I have a less profitable but still profitable green version that provides some non-financial benefit, that we can then decide whether that is worth it or not. So one thing that's important not to include in our decision is often I hear arguments from students, oh, well, if we do the environmentally responsible choice, then we will get positive PR, we'll get positive customer reactions, and so that should feed into our sales, and we can treat it almost like a marketing expense. And that's true, right? Doing positive things like donating to charity or having environmental initiatives do have those kind of effects for companies, but we're going to assume that those effects are folded into the 208. So after taking into account all the positive monetary outcomes we would expect from doing wind generation, we get a value of 208. And factoring in all the negatives maybe we'll get from doing coal, we get a value of 220. So these are including the financial consequences of this decision. And the question is, if you were a manager for this project, excuse me, which would you choose? And I've done this in lots of different contexts, and you can decide for yourself what you would do. I found that I think on average students tend to lean towards the green version, but it usually is a roughly an even split, with maybe a little bit more on the green side than not. But this is important to keep in mind, so I just want to shelve that outcome for a second. And we're going to talk about what finance theory has to say about what should motivate this decision. So when we usually think about investment from a financial standpoint, we start with basically we start with a shareholder value kind of framework, and think about shareholders or any investors really want three things from their investment. And we're going to give up spending the money now in exchange for some kind of financial reward later. and that financial reward will improve our life in a couple specific ways. So first, if I'm doing a financial investment, I want to have that financial investment have the best returns possible, all else equal. So obviously, I don't want to rob a bank or its financial equivalent, but given a set of equally moral alternatives, the one that produces the most wealth for me, it will be my preference relative to the other two. That's an assumption we make about shareholder value. So we want the wealth to be as high as possible, or the returns to be as high as possible, all else equal. We want to have the most desirable time pattern of spending. So we'll talk a little bit more about why we might care about that, but it becomes important to thinking about what kind of investments are attractive to investors among a set of investments with the same return. So if I've got a collection of things I could invest in, all that have the same financial average, right? The average return is the same. Then I'm going to compare on other criteria, one of which might be the timing of when I get the money. And lastly, we want to manage the risk characteristics of the consumption plan. That's a really specific phrase. And what we're talking about is we want to lower the risk of our spending decisions so that we don't have to give up spending when we kind of need it, and we don't have extra spending when we don't need it. So we're going to talk each of these points in general, but these three big overall guiding principles lead to a lot of the things we take for granted in academic finance. For example, thinking about how we describe one company being riskier than another company. The very idea of risk at all seems to suggest that there's more to investing than just getting the best returns you can. And these three guiding principles absolutely lead to that conclusion, because you might have a higher wealth on average, but in a time pattern of consumption with risk characteristics that are really unattractive. And so the extra returns aren't worth it. So the first principle was that all else equal, you want to be as rich as possible. That sounds a little mercenary, but again, the key here is that all else equal. Obviously, right, if I have a choice between an investment that pays a good return that I'm morally uncomfortable with, and an investment that pays a bad return that I find morally attractive, then I'm going to pick the lower monetary return. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're saying, well, I have a moral project that pays me well, and I have a moral project that pays me poorly. Between those two, which we would choose? Well, with nothing else to go on, we're going to choose the wealthier return. So the idea would be you'd have to dream up a situation in which, all else equal, you'd rather have lower returns. If that's the case, then you could make a pretty compelling argument that maybe that person should spend some of that money now and then invest what's left over in the good return, right? So if I had $100,000 and I had an opportunity to make 10% and an opportunity to make 5%, if I really wanted 5% instead of 10%, I could always spend $50,000 and then invest the remainder in the 10% outcome. And that would be my preference normally, because people tend to be impatient by nature. Given the choice between spending now and spending later, we choose to spend now. But often we forgo spending now because we are expecting to get compensation for being patient, and that compensation is worth it. So, for example, I have money in my retirement accounts, and I can, at any time, basically, I can pull that money out of my retirement account, pay a 10% penalty plus whatever income tax I would pay on that money because it's taxable income in the year I remove it, and spend it. So, and I could do that, and I could spend that money, but I am choosing not to because well, first of all those costs add up to be a lot, and so I'm willing to wait until retirement to get my retirement money because the costs are not worth my patience level is high enough that I'm willing to wait to get those payments. And different people have different patience level. So anyway, so we in average, when we're thinking about a financial transaction, we want that financial transaction to have the average outcome of that transaction to be better if we can. And again, there's trade-offs here, but if we can get it to be better, we want it to be better. The average return, the average outcome. So that's principle one. So let's unpack this desirable time pattern of consumption a little bit. So these are two articles from 2011, and it's really describing two different situations, both involving Warren Buffett. So Goldman Sachs took out a loan from Warren Buffett during the financial crisis, and so this is an article about Goldman Sachs paying back Warren Buffett for his investment. I'm not going to click on these links here. Last time I did in class, it was right after a Miley Cyrus VMA performance, and both sides of the article were full of Miley Cyrus advertisements. So hopefully that it has shifted since, but the article is still good. The second one is very similar. So again, in the financial crisis, General Electric needed money. Uncle Warren had some, and so he offered to lend them money in the financial crisis at favorable terms. And in 2011, they chose to pay it back. So this is important. Why were these companies going to Warren Buffett in a financial crisis for loans that had really high interest rates? If I'm a company, why pay Warren Buffett large interest rates when I could get lending like I normally do from a different location and pay lower interest rates? And as you can imagine, the answer is, well, they would have if those things were available, but they weren't. It was the middle of the financial crisis. Banks lending was seized up, and companies had to get creative to secure financing to stay afloat during the crisis. And so Warren Buffett was there ready with his checkbook, or at least the checkbook of Berkshire Hathaway, to support with a loan Goldman and General Electric. And so, okay, so what's the point of this anecdote? Well, what we're talking about or thinking about is that if I'm Warren Buffett, I am able to command a higher return than other lending sources. And why am I able to do that? Well, I am able to do that because I'm still in business in the middle of a financial crisis. Right? That I'm still lending even when lending is dried up. That is a desirable time pattern, right? So that would be a time when money is dear and precious. So you can think about two different investments. One that pays you money when money broadly across the global economy is dear and precious, and a different one where, broadly speaking, money shows up when money isn't dear and precious. So I'll give you a good example of a company like that. So Brunswick is a company you might be familiar with them as a bowling accessories producer. Right? They make the pin racking devices you see at bowling alleys, and a bunch of other bowling related products. But that they're a diversified company with lots of lines of business. And another important line of business for Brunswick are fiberglass shelled luxury personal watercraft. So think water ski boats, fishing boats, ocean going fishing boats, small yachts, that kind of thing. So these are luxury boats. Often they have sleepers and cabins and that kind of thing. So if you think about that kind of business, if I'm a luxury boat manufacturer, does my money show up when money is precious, or does my money show up when everybody has money to burn? Well, the answer is money to burn, right? We buy new luxury boats when there's lots and lots of money and the economy is doing well. And when the economy is poor and things are bad, not only are people not buying luxury boats, but they're desperately looking to sell the luxury boat that they have. When in the depths of the crisis, Brunswick, at least in this division, in the boat division, went from a large number of factory locations to 2, and where large I think is maybe 10 or 12. I mean, it's a very drastic cut in the number of locations of basically factories making the boats, and including all the layoffs that come with shuttering so many plants. But in fact, Brunswick managed to survive, or most of the other boat manufacturers went out of business because they cut enough that they were able to still lose money but stay afloat, whereas their competitors did not. And so luxury boat manufacturing does not have a desirable time pattern of consumption. And so relative to a different business, we would demand more returns from Brunswick than we would from a different company, because it pays us when we don't need it to, and it just dies and drops in value a ton right when we're really desperate to have money to stay alive. Okay, so all else equal, we want to get paid when the economy is in a poor state, because that money is more valuable than money when the economy is in a rich state. So again, we've got another principle where we think about all else equal. So the kind of investments we like are the ones that pay us a lot of money that when the economy is bad, and we don't like investments that don't pay us a lot of money, and if they do, it pays us when the economy is good. And obviously there's a trade-off between these two, right? So if I can get lots of returns but only when the economy is good, or I get bad returns but only when the economy is bad, given the choice between those two things, it's not obvious, right? We're willing to give up some return to get a better time pattern of consumption, but how much we're willing to get up is a matter of it's a personal decision-making matter. It depends on the individual and aggregate risk preferences and time and patience level of market participants. So that's principle 2, right? Number 1 was we want the average outcome to be high, average returns. Principle 2 is we want the money to show up right when we need it as opposed to disappear right when we need it. And the last is risk. So we're going to talk a little bit about risk, break it down a bit. But it all comes from the general idea that risk, that $1 to a millionaire family is worth less than $1 to a working class family. I mean, millionaires still like a dollar. It just, in terms of their overall well-being, $1 is not that helpful, whereas $1 to a working class family would be helpful, at least a little bit. So often when we think about how much money is valuable to different wealth classes, we often will make the assumption that percentage changes in wealth are roughly equivalent. So if I have a millionaire and I have an opportunity to get $100,000, that would be roughly equivalent to a working class family getting $5,000 if they have $50,000 of equity and maybe a car and a house and odds and ends and family possessions. And so in percentage terms, maybe it balances, but investments are, they're not going to scale by the percentage of our personal wealth. They're just going to pay what they're going to pay. And so for an investment to either go up or down means that when it goes up, it's going to give us money when we're relatively rich, and when it goes down, it'll give us money when it's relatively or when we're relatively not rich, that last dollar. And so we don't like to get money when it's not as valuable to us, and we don't like to lose money when it's really valuable to us. So this is different from the time pattern, and this is very personal. This is when I have money versus when I don't. And the other one is when the economy has money versus when the economy doesn't. So given those three criteria, let's go back to the green question, the green project question. So which has the higher average? Well, the 220 is higher than 208. Which one had the better time pattern of consumption? Well, they have the same, right? We said that other than the electricity generation option, they have the same, everything else is the same. So the time pattern of consumption is the same, and the risk level is basically the same. Now you could, if you dig down really deep, maybe you can say something about commodity prices and the value of wind generation, but honestly, I don't think that helps you here, because if we do a wind-based solution, then we're just going to invest once and get the same power output no matter what, so it becomes somewhat economically invariant. Whereas a coal plant, if the economy is doing poorly, commodities tend to do poor as well, which would make coal cheap. And when coal is cheap, that makes our business more profitable. And so coal is actually maybe a little more attractive from a time value consumption thing, if any. But even knowing all of those things, I think a lot of us, and in my experience, most of, or at least more than half of us, would have chosen the green project anyway. So what's going on? Is this ignorance, and we really should just understand that these three principles are really what matters, and the other things that we maybe considered in our decision or are not rational, that we should be coldly logical in our assessment of financial products, and we let our emotions get the best of us. So, as a professor, I occasionally have the opportunity to profess things. It's in the job description, and I am going to profess right now on my soapbox here that we are not wrong in at least considering the value of the green project outside of these three things. And I have an argument for why this is true. So usually when we think about financial investments, we think about the value to us of the money that they pay us. And for a lot of things, this is fairly straightforward. So for example, if I have a choice between a 1-year CD at a bank, a 1-year deposit, if I put my money in 1 year at a bank versus I put my money for 2 years at a bank, I'm going to get different returns depending on which I choose. And it's hard to imagine how strong moral sensibilities will really help you make a choice there, right? A 2-year CD versus a 1-year CD is not, there's not a lot of morality baked into that kind of choice. But often that's not what we're faced with. So in reality, when we make choices based on the monetary outcomes, but also on a bunch of other things like how it affects our family, our overall ethics, quality of life. And obviously, the difference between buying FedEx and buying UPS is not going to have a strong effect on my weekends and holidays, right? But there are things that would. So for example, I would never, at least on purpose, directly own any investment in a tobacco company. Obviously, you might be very passionate in your love of Newport or something, or Virginia Slims, but I am not. Right? I have, I don't like the health consequences, and I don't like the addictive nature of cigarettes, and so I just would not be comfortable morally with making money from an investment in a tobacco company. But still, I mean, those returns are still there. In fact, there's a little bit of indication that the returns are slightly better. So I'm walking away. But given given an argument about my utility, my overall value that I get from the investment, I do actually would personally value the money I would receive, but the amount of money that I receive, the value of that to me, would be significantly less than the value I forego by not picking a more palatable investment, right? That I have, in economic terms, a utility to investing in something that doesn't offend my moral sensibilities, and that utility would be higher for a non-tobacco investment than for a tobacco investment, even if the tobacco investment was expected to make a little more money with the same time pattern and the same risk profile. And so that means, from a financial standpoint, if this is true, that these non-financial factors can be relevant to an overall financial decision making, even ignoring or including accurately the monetary effects of these decisions. Okay, so really in economics we talk about a preference for bundles, and the 208 is a bundle, right? It's a bundle of -12 opportunity cost and positive environmental outcomes. And if the owners of the firm have a preference for paying the $12 million in opportunity cost to receive the non-financial benefit, then their utility will be maximized by doing so. And so we can ask, well, how much then in monetary terms is the green option worth for someone choosing the 208? Well, we don't know, but we can set a lower bound on it, right? We know that it's worth at least 12, or the managers would have chosen the 220 instead. Right, so we don't necessarily know the dollar value, but we can at least put a lower bound on it at $12 million if a manager was a selector of the green option. So this actually will tie into a common thread in thinking about financial analysis. Often when we think about, from an academic finance perspective, what firms should be doing, we talk about shareholder theory or shareholder wealth maximization, that the objective of management should be to maximize value for shareholders. And often this receives criticism because this maybe puts the outcomes of shareholders above other interested parties. But a finance academic would counter and say, no, shareholders' wealth will be maximized when they treat everyone with the respect, or I guess the honoring of contracts and relationships, such that the firm can do its job and produce wealth. So, for example, if I am really hostile with the union negotiations, I might save a little money in the short term, but ultimately cost the firm by destroying a long and positive relationship. So a finance academic would say, well, we can still focus on shareholder value because it was not in the financial best interest of the shareholders to be mean to their employees or to negotiate overly aggressively with a union or with the government. But this avoids a key area, I think, in that shareholders want more than just their wealth maximized. They actually want their utility maximized. And so utility maximization can be consistent with a stakeholder focus of the firm rather than a shareholder focus. For example, so if I'm a shareholder, I may want to forgo some monetary benefit in the interest of making my doing right or improving the value proposition to some of my stakeholders. So, for example, we take Costco as a pretty famous example. The Costco pays their workers significantly more than other equivalent retail employees, and the management is often subject to criticism for this decision. But the truth of the matter is, there are very likely Costco shareholders that are happy to own shares in Costco precisely because they, relative to market rates, overpay their employees. And so, therefore, you can get the conclusion that strictly monetary analysis, even including risk profiles, is insufficient to accurately describe what happens in the marketplace. And to give a good example of that, so it's a little old, but this absolutely happened. So Al Gore launched an investment fund, so you could invest money with Al Gore's management company, and they would invest it on your behalf, but they would do it in environmentally responsible firms. So rather than just picking the broad spectrum of funds, they would restrict themselves just to funds that were behaving in an environmentally responsible way. Naturally, if you're picking from a smaller set than the bigger set, you're foregoing opportunity, and you would expect that returns would be smaller on average, but the fund anyway attracted $5 billion. So you can say, well, people are ignorant and they don't know what's best for them, and they really shouldn't be giving money to Al Gore, but that argument doesn't hold weight with me, because I think that actually does provide value to those investors, right? They do like investing in a fund that has morals that they're comfortable with, and to some degree they're willing to pay for it, right? They're willing to forgo expected returns a little bit in the interest of getting something non-financially attractive. And so we can think about being socially responsible in our application of finance, and that includes making intelligent decisions that include both the financial outcomes and the non-financial effects on investors' utility. And then we want to maximize the well-being of our investors, not just the size of their checking accounts. Again, though, often, right, this won't be relevant. Many financial decisions are strictly that, financial. We're looking at, and when we look at two different potential products, they often will have very similar moral and ethical profiles. So in that case, our personal morality is not going to help us make a decision, and so we have to then stick strictly with the numbers. But often this is not the case. There are moral considerations that come to bear, and we are forced to look at them in concert with the financial ones. Just as an example, let's just suppose we can pay two ways to do a project, and we take $10 million and then earn 16, so we're going to make $6 million, but it'll take 3 years to get it. Or we can turn 10 to 16 in 4 years and hire twice as many people at higher wages. So this would be us potentially putting non-financial value on this potential investment avenue. So if shareholders themselves value providing good jobs, so they value the notion that we're going to hire twice as many people at higher wages, how can this affect us financially? And the answer is, since investment funds have supply and demand, if we provide an opportunity that has greater demand, it can reduce the costs, the price equilibrium. And so what we end up with is a situation where the investors might be willing to accept a lower return, and therefore from a company's perspective, even them ignoring their moral sensibilities, but the moral sensibilities of the shareholders will drive them to seek cheaper investment funds by attracting investors who are willing to accept a lower rate to get a better non-financial profile. So there's some math here to sort of show where the break-even point would be, but the point is, in this case, if I have an investor that is willing to accept 8% for the low labor case and 5% for the high labor case, it would be in the best interest of the firm to do the high labor version of the project, even though it is less profitable in absolute terms, because the decreased returns of the project are more than offset by the significantly decreased cost of raising the financing. And so this is the kind of situation where the morality of the shareholders can affect the financial bottom line of the firm itself. And so really what this means is often when we think about business ethics, we're considering maybe situations where companies behaved badly, or we're going to set strict codes of behavior to avoid immoral outcomes in the business world. But I think we can actually do better that and focus on how can we increase the well-being of our investors by carefully taking into account both their financial and non-financial interests. And I think often this will lead to business decision-making that has increased morality and a more positive effect on human society, even if profitability can in some ways decline, but overall value increase because because investors are willing to forgo profits to improve their well-being. Also, this means that shareholders are effectively culpable for the morals they bring to their investment decisions. Right? If investors don't care if companies are moral or not and invest equally in companies that are moral or not, there's no financial gain to a company being moral. Whereas if investors care and they're willing to provide funds to firms that care, then firms will themselves decide to care to get the benefit. Right? That firms will choose to be moral to gain access to funds from investors who demand that they're moral. And so investors themselves can drive change in the morality of companies themselves just because they're leaving money off the table if they don't. Okay, so that was all very big picture. Obviously, it doesn't really feed directly into any homework you're working on right now, but I think it's important to get a picture just in moral terms for what finance is all about and how we can make moral decisions in our financial framework as well as strictly financial decisions. Okay, so when we come back, we'll talk about getting some uncertainty into our financial decision making.